All right, so what I'm going to share with you is the history of the founder of this church, John Milton Shields, and also some other stories about the earliest pioneering founders of this church. Now, just as a little preamble, I came to know that John Milton Shields was the founder of this church because I attended this church as a child, and of course I heard about the Shields, and also I came to know his descendants, the Adams family, who lived right across the road from us. And the Adams family, many of them are still here, waving behind. So the descendants of John Milton. And I think actually that photograph over here, you're descended through Helen, right?
Yes.
Yeah, she's the little babe, the baby in arms. Oh, okay, yeah, with that. Yeah. So that family. They lived right across the road from my family. We lived at the ranger station. My father was. So I knew about this Dr. Shields, but I didn't really know the depth of this man until recently. And I've been interacting with Amy, and she just casually mentioned that Dr. Reverend Shields had fought in the Civil War.
Wow.
And furthermore, he fought at Little Round Top.
Wow.
So if any of you know Civil War history, you probably know that the Battle of Gettysburg was one of the most famous and important battles of the entire Civil War. And the fighting at Little Round Top was the most intense, and it was the crucial point on that battlefield that won that battle, and ultimately really kind of won the Civil War. And so I was amazed. I thought, wow, Shields was at Gettysburg? And then Amy mentioned that, well, he had a diary. He kept a diary from 1861 when he entered the Army at the age of 19 years old to 1865. He kept a daily diary, and he has an entry for every single day from 1861 to 1865. So I got a hold of the copy of the Civil War diary that has been transcribed by Liz's daughter, Liz Adams' daughter, took the diary and transcribed it and published it as a published version of John Milton Shields' Civil War diary. Okay? And it's incredible. It's amazing. Okay, so I've been reading that. And then also, Amy so kindly loaned to me a copy of Dr. Shields' medical ledger when he was a country doctor here in Hamus Springs from 1894 to 1900. 7 years of record of all of the people he treated, what he treated them for, and the medications he gave them.
Wow.
There's several hundred entries in this handwritten medical ledger. Okay?
Wow.
So I read through that, and I have to tell you, Suzanne can tell you about this. It brought me to tears because he was a very good and compassionate man. I'll tell you more. So this is a preamble. John Milton Shields. I'm going to give you his biography, and along the way, I'm going to tell a couple stories that are in the book, in my book about Hamus Springs. What's so amazing about him was that he had a very difficult life, filled with death and woe. Incredible amount of death that this man saw. But he also had great light and joy and faith. In fact, once you hear about what he went through, you'll be amazed about the resiliency of this man. And this is the word, resilient. You know that word? It's being able to bounce back from a hit, from a hard hit, and to carry on. And so this man, he knew how to do that. And the only explanation I could have for that is he was a great man of faith. He believed in Christ, and he had that hope and faith that helped him to sustain him through an incredibly difficult time. So to begin with his biography, he was born in 1841 in Pennsylvania, about 60 miles northeast of Pittsburgh. And he was a very, it's Indiana County, a little town called Indiana, Pennsylvania. 60 miles northeast of Pittsburgh. Okay. So the county itself, by the way, 1860s, was a hotbed of abolitionism and anti-slavery. There were multiple anti-slavery newspapers. So he grew up in he was on a farm in a very religious setting, in a very anti-slavery setting. Okay. And his diary in 1861 starts before the war, and like almost every 2 or 3 days, he's going to church, Presbyterian church. He's going there in the evening he's gone to preaching is usually what he would say. gone to preaching, and then of course every Sunday. And it was clear that he was interested in becoming a doctor. So by April of 1861, he is being tutored by a local doctor to become a medical doctor, to become a doctor himself. He's 19 years old, 19, okay? April 22nd, the first firing on Fort Sumter by the Confederate Army, which started the Civil War, April 22nd. And then the news filtered to Pennsylvania, and he enlisted immediately. And the 11th Pennsylvania Reserve Regiment, 11th Pennsylvania Reserve Regiment. Okay, so he's by July of 1861, he's training. And then by August, they're in battle. Now here's the thing about his Civil War experience. The 11th Pennsylvania Reserves became known as the Bloody 11th. The Bloody 11th. Why is that? Because they had one of the highest fatality rates of any regiment in the Union Army in the course of the war. Out of 2,000 regiments, so a regiment in the Civil War is about 1,000 men. They had the 8th highest fatality rate at the end of the war. Out of 2,000 regiments, they were the 8th highest regiment of death. Okay, about 1,000 men were started out, and they at the end of the war, about 1,200 men that served in the 11th Regiment through replacements. 350 mustered out. All the rest were killed or wounded or missing. 350 out of about 1,200. And this Civil War diary of young men, so it's so understated. Every day there's an entry. And let me just tell you the battles he was in. He was in a battle called, in late 1861, called Gaines Mill, Mechanicsville. In that battle, his regiment was pretty new. There were about 800 men in the regiment at that time. And there were 10 companies. 10 companies. He was in Company B, about 100 men. 9 of those companies got surrounded and killed or captured. His company did not get captured because they were over doing some other work behind the lines. And then later on the day, that company was engaged in fighting in hand-to-hand combat, and about half of the company was killed. Later on, the companies that were captured were released and exchanged, and they rejoined. So his 11th Regiment was reconstituted. So he won battle after battle after battle. You probably know some of these names. Bull Run, second Bull Run. They were at second Bull Run. Antietam. Wow. They were at Antietam. Fredericksburg. Wow. Gettysburg. The Wilderness. Spotsylvania Courthouse. So, I mean, if you are any kind of a student of the Civil War, you'll know, wow, this is like the who's who of the greatest battles. And you know what happened? I'm reading the diary and reading another history of the Civil War. His regiment and the battalion he was in, they were just battle after battle. They were almost wiped out, and then they were reconstituted with people coming back from the hospital and new volunteers, and they kept on going. By the middle of the war, his regiment was down to about 350 men from 1,000, and they fought 350 men, getting more people getting killed all along the way. And he went through it all. I mean, except for he was in the hospital, had measles. He actually missed Antietam. He was in the hospital sick a number of times, which is very common for Civil War soldiers to be killed. But he was there for some of the biggest battles, Fredericksburg and Gettysburg. Gettysburg. So I don't know if you've ever watched the movie Gettysburg. It's a great one. Jeff Daniels, fantastic movie. Martin Sheen plays Robert E. Lee. Great movie, you haven't seen it. And then the hero in that movie, of course, is Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who was the commander of the 20th Maine on Little Round Top. Well, the 20th Maine saved the Union Army on July 2nd with their desperate attack. Fixed bayonets. They ran out of ammunition and they fixed bayonets and charged. Okay, and so that's the story I always heard was Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was this hero of mine. Well, it turns out the Bloody 11th was so Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was on the south slope. The Bloody 11th was on the north slope, and they did the same thing. They fixed bayonets and charged. So the Bloody 11th also saved the day that same day. And he went through all this. So just for a moment, think about this. 600 to 700,000 Americans were killed. 600 to 700, all more more Americans were killed in that war than all our other wars combined, factor of 2. And he saw it. He saw it. He saw his friends and his fellow colleagues being killed at every one of these battles. He saw horrendous sights. He's so succinct and brief in his diary. Saw some hard sights. Terrible day to day. Many friends killed. Anyway, so this guy went through the war. Finally, in 1864, they had a 3-year term, and they mustered him out in June of 1864. The war is still going on. He gets to go home for a couple months and recuperates, and he re-enlists in another Pennsylvania regiment. And this one is a hospital, is a medical regiment. That's what he was interested in. And he becomes a hospital steward, which is basically, he was running a hospital. And the hospital he was running was on the front lines of the siege of Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. So he's there with, wounded and sick people coming into his hospital daily, all throughout late 1864, all the way up through Appomattox. And he ended up, the Confederates abandoned Richmond, and they occupied Richmond, and he went into Richmond. So he does that to 1865. He's finally mustered out. Finally, he gets to follow his dream, and he goes to medical college, the Albany Medical School in New York, which at the time was like one of the premier medical colleges in the country. And it's still operating today. It's one of the oldest medical schools in the country. And they were teaching state-of-the-art medicine at that time from 1865 to 1868. They're teaching him germ theory. They were just developing vaccines and how to vaccinate, which becomes critical later on, as we'll see. So he does that till 1868. He gets married to a woman, Ann Davis, in 1869, right soon after he finished medical school. And they have one child, Harvey. And soon thereafter, she dies. I'm not sure exactly what. Maybe it was even childbirth. I'm not sure. I don't know. So his first wife dies, leaves him with a small child. And he remarries pretty quickly to Emily Harvey, right? And then they have a child, Linus, right? So they have 2 kids. And he becomes an elder and in the Presbyterian Church. He's very religious man, very faithful man. Otho, right? Otho and Harvey. Yeah, Linus was with his. So he's got a second wife. He's ordained, and they decide to go on a mission to New Mexico, right? And why them? Well, he's a medical doctor, and Jemez Pueblo is in the middle of a smallpox outbreak in 1878. So they go as medical missionaries to Jemez Pueblo across the country by train, right? And stagecoach. I'll tell you that in a minute, that story. So just to show the commitment here, they had a farm in Pennsylvania. They mortgaged it to pay for their travels and to partly pay for their mission. I'm sure the Presbyterian Church was helping, but they mortgaged the farm to come out. So they take the train trip. The train at that time ended in El Moro, Colorado. They took a wagon to Trinidad, Colorado, and then they took a stagecoach from Trinidad to Santa Fe. And there's amazing stories about this. By the way, the other source of this information is the Presbyterian records here in the church. There's a written account by Dr. Shields of this trip, and it's pretty amazing. So they get to Santa Fe. Well, from Trinidad to Santa Fe was an adventure because it was a stagecoach on leather springs, was bouncy, and it was top heavy, and the stagecoach drivers were drinking whiskey. Not drunk. And they rolled it. They rolled the stagecoach, and Emily got a big gash on her head and probably a concussion, right? And one of the boys were 8 and 11, and one of the boys got really sick. So they got a sick kid, and Emily's got a concussion, right? And then after the rollover, the whiskey, the guys got sober, I guess. They got him to Santa Fe. And when they got to Santa Fe, this is Shields writing, just to give you a sense of it, and actually his words. And I get a little how did they manage this, right? It says, over the range lay the great unknown and the cactus plains, where the shriek of the engine had never wakened the echoes or alarmed the antelope. Where the railway ended, commenced the old Santa Fe Trail. 220 miles, it stretched away to the ancient city of Holy Faith, Santa Fe. 220 miles. Okay. How much of interest, anxiety, and almost fear we felt in regard to what lay before us. But we know that in the old new land that lay before us, the people were perishing for lack of vision. We could well afford to dismiss our fears and to thank God and take courage. What a strange and thrilling joy the true soldier feels when he is permitted to do something real hard for his country, exclamation point. And how much more for the soldier of the cross. We had God's promise that he would be with us always, and we were sent to peoples of fierce countenances and strange tongues, but with the promise of the Almighty God that no one should set upon us to hurt us.
Wow.
So he writes this about their trip too. And they finally got a wagon, horse-drawn wagon ride from Santa Fe to Amos Pueblo. And they set up, they started building their church and their school. They started teaching the kids the school there. And they started getting a larger and larger following, possibly from the kids also coming to church. And there was deep feelings there. Here's what he said about the children. We have loved these dear children ever since coming here, and they seem to know it and appreciate it, and we hope they love us too. That was nice. So they did that for quite a few years until 1881, well, 4 years. And then they decided to build this church here at Amos Springs. At the time, Amos Springs was building up. The Oteros built a hotel here and the bathhouse, and they had dreams of this being like the Yellowstone of the Southwest. There were rumors about a railroad was going to be brought up here. You know, it was going to be a resort, and people were moving here and living here. And it turns out one of the guys who built the hotel that was an investor was Francisco Perea. Francisco Perea was a famous guy himself. He was a territorial representative in Congress. He was a good friend of Abraham Lincoln. And in his retirement, he moved here to Amos Springs in 1881, and they built this hotel. And it turns out Francisco Perea's brother was Jose Inez Perea, who was the first ordained Presbyterian minister, Hispanic ordained minister in New Mexico. And so the Pereas were Presbyterians. And they came here, and the Shields decided to move their operation up here. They kept the school going down at the Pueblo. And there were multiple other missionaries who came. Well, forgot to say, in 1878, they arrived in March of 1878. In November, Emily died. His second wife died and left him with the 2 boys. So he's a widower for the second time. The Presbyterian Church sends out some more missionaries, his cousin Laura and another missionary woman by the name of Isabella. And he married Isabella in 1879. And then they had 8 children, mostly here in Amos Springs. Okay, mostly here in Amos Springs. The 8 children, of which I should say also, like only 5 of them lived to adulthood. 3 of them died in childhood, and they died from like the ages of like 1 to like 8. Yeah. So they lost beloved children. Okay, they were losing children. So just a little jump ahead. Isabella died in 1900, when she was only 50, and left him again for the 3rd time, a widower with small children here in Amos Springs. Right? So we went through 3 wives with illnesses and death and sickness, and then 3 children. Right? And back again, remind you, he came there to help with the smallpox outbreak. And so he was dealing in Amos Pueblo, the first smallpox outbreak there in 1878. 60 people died in the Pueblo, 60. So he was helping and administering to those people as they were dying in the 1870s. Right? He comes up here finally, and he's the minister here in this church. They build this church, and it was a really remarkable in the valley here. Besides the Pereas, the Sandoval family and the Archuletas. So these were original settlers here, the original land grant settlers. The Archuletas owned that building right across the road there. There was a building right there. It's probably that existing building, Amos Mountain Inn. It's got the bones of the original Archuleta house. They gave the property for this church, and then they were baptized here. Right? So the Archuleta family were Presbyterians, were baptized. The Sandoval family were still here. They were all baptized and in the church. So there were multiple Hispanic families, as well as the the various people coming in for the hotel were here in the church. So he was minister here and the medical doctor. And here's where the medical ledger is quite amazing. I go through it, just all the names of the people that he was serving up here. And it's like, went in the middle of the night to go help with so-and-so, stayed till the next morning, or stayed till the next morning, stayed until he died on the next day. So he was constantly being called out in the middle of the night to go 20 miles somewhere to deal with something, help somebody. Delivering babies. There's two, actually at least two that I can tell babies that he delivers. There's knife wounds and a gunshot wound he's treating. And what's all through this, you can get the sense of the humanity of this man. He is carrying death. And you can tell the poorer families, you can tell he's got their treatment all on one page and it kind of goes on to the next page. And it's never any indication that's ever paid. Right, because he's got one, the billed amount, and there's the amount paid, and there's many, many cases that are never paid. And in fact, and there's one case in which he says this family is poor, and the debt is forgiven. Right side. So he was a deeply compassionate man through those days. Now here I'll just read a couple more things here. So he's here and he's serving through the 1880s and 1890s. The Fentons, Elijah McLean Fenton, Reverend Elijah McLean Fenton here, I think arrived in like 1893 or 1894 with his family. And and Dr. Shields was retiring or semi-retiring about that time. He's still preaching here in the church occasionally. But Reverend Fenton is starting to take over. And the Fentons, by the way, they homesteaded up there on the Cibola Creek. And that's Fenton Lake, is of course. They had a big house up there. They lived here in Hamos Springs too. They had a house here in Hamos Springs as well. So they lived here in Hamos Springs, usually in the wintertime. They went up there in the summertime. Fentons did. Okay, so the Fentons and the Shields are kind of, and actually living side by side. The Dr. Shields' house was right across the road from the old mission ruins, the old Hamos historic site. So right about where the Servants of the Paraclete building is, that's where the Shields' house was. It no longer is in existence, I don't think. But anyway, they lived up there. And I have the book, by the way, tells some of this history. And there's a chapter in there called Presbyterians in the Hamos. So check that one out. It kind of tells some of Shields' story, and it's got this little clip I'm going to read to you right now. There's another chapter in there on something like Visit to the Cibola. This is in 1903. And so a visitor here, this guy's a British scholar from Oxford, for crying out loud, comes here in 1903 on a return trip. He was here in 1870s. It was like a trader down at Hamos Public, and had all sorts of stories this guy had from his 1870s. He came back here in 1903, and he visited the Millers. So the Millers, John Miller, was a trader at Hamos Pueblo, and one of the missionaries who came to Hamos Pueblo was Mary Strite. There's a story about Mary Strite coming up here to the Hamos too in the book. And she married John Miller down at the Pueblo. And then they moved up here about the same time the Shields moved up here, maybe a little bit later. They moved up here a little bit later than the Shields. So this guy, Townshend, the British guy, he knew the Millers, and he stayed with the Millers when he came here in 1903. And so this guy, he was kind of an adventurer, young guy in his 20s or so when he was here in the 1870s and had all kinds of adventures. And he comes back here in 1903. And he's like middle-aged guy at that point, and you can imagine he's a little kind of stuffy British guy, But he'd been a Westerner, so he was, he really actually loved it out here, and he loved the Hamos. But he's just a little bit kind of snidely remarks here a little bit about Dr. Shields, because I don't think he really knew who Shields was, or Perea for that matter. He'd interacted with Perea, but Perea was a guy in himself too. But so he's staying, this guy, Townshend, is here in 1903, visiting John Miller and Mary, and they're pillars of the church. They're elders in the church here. Mary played the organ, which they call the harmonium. The harmonium, okay? So they one Sunday, they walk from the Miller's house up there by the old mission church down here to the Pueblo, down here to the church. So the next day, we all walk to the Presbyterian church in the blazing sun. Oh, I don't know how to express things at all. Here, where I was a member of that somewhat semi-civilized community, we have two churches, one Roman Catholic, one Presbyterian. And who are the Presbyterian elders? Colonel Francisco Perea, who said, "Wait," to me back in the 70s. And Miterio Archuleta, who helped me drive those steers to Santa Fe. And I was a young spark then. I sat in a chair in a little whitewashed barn sort of place. And Miterio came and gave me a hymn book in Spanish. And Mrs. Miller played the wheezy harmonium. And we made a joyful noise. Yeah, great. We all made a joyful noise this morning. So, well, I need not say much more. It used to be the Dark Ages, flagellants, witches, and murderers. And now the hymn and old Dr. Shields preaching. It would take a Hardy, the author, to give the curious irony of it. I guess it had to be. I guess it's for the best. Yet if I could express the change in words, I'd make folks feel something. I sat in a chapel alongside Mrs. Miterio Archuleta, old now, one tooth, grizzled, parchment face. I remember her young, charming, and would she say these days are better than those? Her face was non-committal, but she came all right to church, and her children and grandchildren. Válgame Dios! If I don't feel as if I'm standing on my head. And John Miller sat in front of me, shaved and clean shirt and black coat, and the young Mexican population around looked bored or intolerant, or whichever it is, including two stalwart sons of Juan Sandoval. I tell you, I thought things. For if we didn't go to the church much in those days 30 years ago, you'd see the young fellows heading for the field when the Padre came. And now I wonder to myself, are the old men and the young men two nations? For it feels as if they were. Or does it mean that there's a real change? And this little Dr. Shields, grizzled, bearded, mild, spectacled, 60, who came out here as a medical missionary and teacher to Jemez in 1878, talking bad Spanish through his nose about la palabra de Dios. Does he represent a winning force? All things here are changed. So, just to summarize, I mean, just think about it. This man, he saw all that death in the war. He saw the death of his 3 wives and his children. And oh, the smallpox epidemic, I forgot to tell you, in 1898, there was another smallpox outbreak, a second smallpox. And he was engaged by the US government to be the doctor leading the vaccination to try to stop it. And so he vaccinated people at Jemez Pueblo and at Zia. And he couldn't vaccinate all the people at Jemez Pueblo for some reason. There were about 450 people, and he couldn't get them all. But he was able to vaccinate everyone at Zia who hadn't had the disease before. And so Jemez Pueblo was about 450 people, and Zia was only like less than 200 people. And he vaccinated everybody at Zia. At Jemez, another 63 people died in 1898, 1899. And in Zia Pueblo, where he vaccinated everybody, there was 1 case. So in the medical literature, he's credited with saving Zia Pueblo.
Where did he get the vaccines from?
So it was coming from the government, and this was back in the day. They didn't have like pre-made injections. They were like, this is kind of sound primitive. They would take the scab off of a smallpox victim, and then they would create a potion from that, and then that would be injected. But that had to be done to do it well, it had to be done by a doctor. And so this is why it's actually, I have a medical journal article about this. This Zia case is kind of, among epidemiologists, a little bit famous because it's a case of where total vaccination, we got everybody vaccinated, and you had a doctor who knew how to give the shots.
They were actually injecting, or were they doing?
Yeah, I think it might have been a scratch. It might have been a scratch. So again, I mean, I just want to leave you with this. It's like this man who saw so much. I mean, I have to say, I have a new culture hero. It's John Shields, and I'm just amazed, and I'm deep admiration for someone who is so resilient. And I must ascribe it to his faith. You know, how else do we witness so much pain and death, and still continue and still to do good? It was the last little thing I saw. I came across a quote from General George Meade, who was the commanding general at Gettysburg, and he had actually been the commanding general of the Pennsylvania Reserve. So he knew the 11th Pennsylvania Reserve very well, and he had written a letter home about a doctor in the regiment who had died from a battle. And he said, such afflictions should reconcile us to our lesser troubles. Right? So this is, I think, important for us now with all the divisiveness in this country and the worry we have for our country. We've been through really much worse times before, and we've come through it. And I think it's come with faith and hope and Christian charity. The last little thing I'll leave you with, and this is something that you should do. If you haven't watched Ken Burns' Civil War series, fantastic, right? And I think it's in the first episode and in the last episode, they show movie footage from 1913, like old, movie footage, and it was the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg, and some of the veterans went back to get it. There was a reunion at Gettysburg of both Confederate and Union soldiers, and so here's this. And by the way, Milton Shields went to the reunion.
Oh, yeah.
His daughter Bessie went with him to help. He was 72 years old. He died 2 years later. In 1913, he went to the reunion at Gettysburg, and so there's this movie footage in the Ken Burns series of these old codgers with their canes. They're reenacting Pickett's charge, and they're going across the field, and a moan goes up from the line, from the Union soldiers' line, and they leapt across the wall. And the old men met in the middle of the field and embraced.
Oh, that's cool.
One of those old men, it might have been John Milton Field.
Wow.
He was there. So something to remember. Our history, what a legacy, huh? To have.
Yeah.